Chapter 1. Ronan's Escape. Ronan's heart pounded in his chest as the shrill alarms blared through the Orion, the ship's interior flashing red in time with the emergency lights. Outside the viewport, the barren planet Zrus loomed, a silent, ominous presence. The crew had been preparing to explore, to catalog and assess the planet for future colonization. But something had gone wrong. Very wrong. The crew of the Orion was already fighting a losing battle. The landing ship, where they'd been holed up for the past few hours, was overrun by insects. Massive, aggressive creatures that had burst from the ground the moment the crew stepped onto the surface. At first, they'd thought it was a minor issue, an annoyance. But soon the bugs began to swarm, biting, injecting venom, tearing into flesh. Those who hadn't succumbed to the bites or venom were left paralyzed or unconscious, lying helpless on the cold ground. Ronan's parents had told him to stay inside the ship, but as the chaos erupted, he couldn't sit idly by. The last thing he remembered before he ran to the landing bay was the desperate voices of the crew, screaming, fighting, trying to hold back the flood of insects that had overtaken them. Then came the order, "Get to the escape pod, Ronan!" Now! He had no choice. As he powered up the Orion, he could hear his mother's voice, shaking, desperate, calling to him over the comms. "Ronan, you have to leave orbit. They're already infected. There's nothing we can do. Go, now!" Tears welled in his eyes as he punched in the commands. Leave orbit! The thought felt impossible. The ship had been built for a mission to another planet, a mission that was supposed to take decades. But now, here he was, alone, the last living member of the Orion's crew, abandoning everything and everyone he had known. He was flying into the vast emptiness of space, and all he could hear were the screams of the crew, the echoes of the insects hissing, and the agonizing crackle of his parents' final transmission. "Mom. Dad," Ronan whispered, his hands shaking as he gripped the ship's controls. The engines fired, pulling the Orion away from the planet's surface. As the ship broke free from the atmosphere, Ronan fought to maintain focus, knowing he couldn't make it home without the interstellar drive systems. The Orion was not designed for escape. It was a ship built for exploration, meant to travel at a steady pace for decades. But now, with no way to make the necessary repairs, Ronan's hope for a swift journey to Earth was a distant dream. All he could do was set course, drifting through the stars, unable to go faster than a crawl. The vast expanse of space stretched out before him, a reminder of his isolation. He didn't know how long it would take to reach Earth. It could take years, decades even, and he couldn't do it alone. But there was no going back. As the Orion drifted into the endless black, Ronan let out a strangled cry, the weight of his loss too much to bear. What happened on Zrus? Why didn't they listen? With a heavy heart, he set the ship's course toward home, the only thing he could hold on to in the crushing void of space. Chapter 2. Drifting Alone. The engines of the Orion hummed faintly, struggling with the weight of a ship built for exploration, not escape. Ronan sat at the helm, the cold emptiness of space stretching out before him like a vast, unbroken sea. He had left Zrus behind, but it felt like he was still there, caught in the grip of that planet's nightmare. The insects, the chaos, his parents' last words, all of it looped in his mind like a broken record. Tears burned in his eyes, but he wiped them away angrily. He couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. Not when the real challenge was just beginning. Ronan's fingers hovered over the control panel, but he knew it was useless. He had no way to engage the Orion's interstellar drive. The ship was stuck in the dark, driftless void of space, moving at a crawl. Earth was a distant dot, light years away, and without a way to reach it faster, the journey would be slow. Too slow. He slumped in the chair, trying to focus. He had to get the systems working. He had to find a way back to Earth. The memories of his parents, their faces, their voices, were all he had left. They had told him to survive, to live. But how? How could he live when he was utterly alone, with nothing but the ghost of their memory and a broken ship? The Orion was meant for exploration, not for survival. The ship's systems were designed to keep the crew alive indefinitely, providing oxygen, food, and water, but it wasn't built for high-speed travel or deep space navigation. It was a slow-moving vessel, meant to carry out a decades-long mission to chart distant stars. Ronan had never imagined it would be his only means of escape. He ran his hands over the console, examining the diagnostics. The life support was holding steady, but that was all. The engines couldn't break free from the gravity of Zrus's orbit, and the interstellar drive was malfunctioning. He didn't have the expertise to fix it, and he wasn't sure who could help him. There was no one out here. Ronan leaned back in his chair, staring at the stars through the viewport. It felt like he was looking through a window into another life, a life he would never get back. He had been trained to pilot the Orion, to chart new worlds, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was getting home. As the hours dragged on, his mind wandered back to the day the crew had landed on Zrus. They hadn't followed protocol. No one had been supposed to leave the ship, especially not for a full planetary exploration. The planet was uncharted, dangerous, but the crew had insisted on going down. Ronan's parents had disagreed, but they hadn't spoken up until it was too late. The truth was, Ronan had no idea why they had gone against orders. Maybe they were just overconfident. Maybe they hadn't realized the danger. Or maybe there was something on Zrus they weren't telling him. He had never questioned them before. Now it was all he could think about. The silence of space was deafening. The Orion floated aimlessly through the stars, its hum the only sound in the vast, empty ship. It would take days, weeks, or even months before Ronan could figure out how to get the interstellar drive functioning again, if he ever could. And in the meantime, he was alone. Alone with the ghosts of his crew. Alone with his guilt. But he had to keep going. There was no other choice. He had to survive, if only to understand what happened to the Orion and the crew who had been lost on Zrus. Chapter 3. Introduction to Serena. The Stellaris cut through the void of space with a smooth hum, its sleek form a stark contrast to the dilapidated Orion Ronan had abandoned. Unlike the Orion, the Stellaris was a newer, more advanced ship, a vessel designed for long-range travel, but its purpose was no different: exploration. Serena had always imagined herself as part of the crew that would carry humanity's hopes across the stars, discovering new worlds and possibilities. Yet, as she stood in the observation deck, staring out at the endless black, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The reality was sinking in. Stellaris wasn't going to make it. The systems designed for a long journey were failing. One by one, the crew had started to notice the irregularities, the flickering lights, the unstable energy levels, the oxygen systems running on backup. It wasn't a complete failure yet, but it was only a matter of time. Captain Harrell's voice echoed over the ship's comms. "Crew meeting in 10 minutes. All hands, report to the briefing room." Serena rubbed her eyes. She'd been awake for hours, working through a list of diagnostics. The Stellaris had been carrying them on a course to a distant colony, a project designed to bring a new generation of settlers to a distant planet. But now, that mission was becoming increasingly unrealistic. The ship simply wasn't designed for the long-term travel it would require. Serena wasn't the only one worried. The crew had been in a tense silence ever since the problems began. They'd gone from excited explorers to people just trying to survive. The gravity of their situation was becoming all too clear, and as the announcement played, Serena couldn't ignore the inevitable truth. They had to change course. As she made her way to the briefing room, she passed fellow crew members, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. The Stellaris was a beacon of hope, a symbol of humanity's desire to reach out beyond the stars. But in that moment, it felt more like a trap. They were heading into the unknown, and their destination was now a distant dream. When Serena entered the briefing room, Captain Harrell was already there, flanked by the rest of the command staff. Their faces were grim. Serena sat down, trying to steady her nerves. She'd been preparing herself for this meeting, but it didn't make the reality any easier. The situation has deteriorated faster than we anticipated, Harrell began, his voice steady but laden with fatigue. We won't make it to our destination. The ship is too far gone. There's no point in continuing this journey. He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. We're going to have to reroute to the nearest inhabitable planet. There was a murmur among the crew. Serena's heart sank. She knew what was coming next. Zrus, Harrell continued. It's the closest planet we can reach. It's not ideal, but we might find resources there that can help us make repairs, and if not, it'll give us time to figure something out. Serena's stomach twisted. Zrus was a planet of mystery, a world that had once been explored, but its ecosystem had been deemed dangerous. It was a planet that the Orion had visited, and if rumors were to be believed, the crew had been destroyed there. The thought of going to Zrus filled Serena with dread, but she knew there was no better option. We can't afford to waste any more time, Captain Harrell said, his voice firm. Prepare yourselves. We're leaving in an hour. As the crew began to disperse, Serena lingered, lost in thought. Zrus. Something didn't sit right with her. She had heard the stories, whispers of what had happened to the Orion, but it didn't add up. Why had the entire crew gone to the surface? That wasn't standard procedure, not for a planet like Zrus. There was more to the story, and she was determined to uncover it. But for now, she had to focus on the task at hand. The Stellaris was still functional enough to make the journey, but that could change at any moment. Serena's thoughts turned back to the mission. If she could save this ship, she would. But if Zrus had really claimed the Orion, what would they find waiting for them there? Chapter 4. The decision to land on Zrus. The briefing room was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the failing systems in the walls. The crew of the Stellaris sat in uneasy silence, their eyes on Captain Harrell. He stood at the front, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. I won't lie to you, Harrell said, his voice steady but strained. The Stellaris is in worse shape than we thought. The damage to the ship's core systems is critical, and without extensive repairs, we won't make it to our destination. We're stranded. Serena could feel the weight of his words settle like a stone in her stomach. She had known it was coming, knew the ship wasn't going to make it, but hearing it confirmed was a harsh reality. Their mission, their hopes for humanity's future, were unraveling in front of them. We have no choice, Harrell continued, his eyes sweeping the room. Our only option now is to head to the nearest inhabitable planet, Zrus. It's not ideal, but it's our best shot at finding resources. Anything that can keep us alive long enough to repair the Stellaris and finish our mission. The room buzzed with murmurs. Zrus. The name alone filled Serena with unease. She had heard the stories, the whispers about the Orion, the ghost ship that had once been there, its entire crew lost. No one had ever returned from Zrus with a happy story. The planet had been classified as dangerous, and the decision to land there, even as a last resort, made Serena feel as if they were walking into a trap. Captain Zrus, Serena began, her voice quieter than she intended. Are you sure that's the best option? The Orion? They went there and never came back. Harrell nodded grimly. I know the stories, Lieutenant, but we don't have the luxury of choices right now. We have to land. If we don't, we're all dead in space. Serena swallowed hard. She couldn't shake the image of the Orion, a lifeless, empty vessel, abandoned in orbit like a tomb. It was a ship she had only heard of in passing, but it haunted her, especially now that their own mission had gone so wrong. The thought of landing on the same planet, the one that had claimed the Orion, felt like they were stepping into a shadow. "What about the risk?" Another crew member, Lieutenant Barlow, spoke up. "What if it's still dangerous down there? The Orion was wiped out. What if that's what we're walking into?" "We'll take precautions," Harold replied, though the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed his words. "We'll land, assess the situation, and move quickly. We don't have the luxury of time. If we don't try, we'll all be dead in the cold." Serena couldn't shake the unease in her chest. Zaldrus was an unknown, but so was the future of the Stellaris. The choice was impossible to ignore. But as the captain's words sank in, Serena felt the gravity of their situation. "We'll prepare the landing teams," Harold said, breaking the silence. "Pack your gear. We leave in 2 hours." As the crew dispersed to begin their preparations, Serena remained seated, staring out of the observation window. She had to make peace with this decision, but it wasn't easy. The shadows of the Orion still loomed over them, and she knew that whatever had destroyed the other ship might still be lurking on Zaldrus. But there was no choice. There was no time to waste. And if they were going to make it out of this, they would have to face whatever waited on that planet, even if it meant uncovering the same dark secret that had claimed the Orion. Chapter 5. Discovering the Ghost Ship. The Stellaris drifted silently in the orbit of Zaldrus, its crew tense, knowing their situation was growing more dire by the minute. Serena stood in the observation deck, staring at the empty space where the Orion now floated, its ghostly form almost hidden in the shadow of the planet below. The ship had been drifting for years, seemingly abandoned, but there was something unnerving about it. It was too still, too quiet, like a relic of something long forgotten. "Lieutenant," Captain Harrell's voice crackled over the intercom. "Prepare a boarding party. We need to know what happened to the Orion. We may find something useful on board, or at least some answers." Serena nodded, her heart heavy. The Orion had been a vessel of hope, a ship designed for exploration. Yet now it was a tomb, its once pristine hull marked with the scars of disaster. Her thoughts raced. Why had the entire crew gone to the surface? Why had no one returned? She assembled a small team, including her most trusted officers. The air was thick with unease as they suited up and made their way to the docking bay. The boarding shuttle was ready, and in minutes, they were pulling away from the Stellaris. The shuttle approached the Orion with caution. It was eerily silent as they docked, the metallic clang of the latch echoing louder than expected. The crew was silent as they floated into the Orion's airlock, which hissed open at their arrival. Serena led the way, her eyes scanning the darkened corridors as they stepped inside. The first thing that hit them was the smell. It wasn't the usual sterile scent of a functioning ship, but a lingering odor of decay, dust, and something else. Something metallic. The lights flickered overhead, casting the halls in an unsettling, erratic glow. "This place hasn't been touched in years," Lieutenant Barlow muttered, his voice tense. They moved through the corridors cautiously, weapons drawn, but there was no sign of life. The ship, despite its damage, appeared to be intact. Systems were still operational in some areas. Communications, life support, even the gravity. It was as if the ship had been abandoned on a whim, leaving everything as it had been, untouched. Serena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Orion was too quiet. It didn't make sense that a ship with an entire crew aboard could simply vanish without a trace. The team moved deeper into the ship, heading toward the command deck. The once pristine panels were cracked, screens dead or malfunctioning. The ship's crew had clearly faced a catastrophe. But what had happened to them? What caused the Orion to come to a screeching halt in the middle of its mission? As they passed through the crew quarters, Serena stopped. Her gaze locked on the doorway, her heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was a person, but something about them seemed out of place. Serena's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward into the dim light. "Who are you?" she demanded, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm. The figure didn't answer immediately. It was a young man, his features drawn and pale, dressed in the tattered remains of the Orion's uniform. His eyes, wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion, fixed on her. I'm Ronan," the boy said, his voice trembling. "I'm the last one left." Serena's pulse quickened. Ronan. She had heard stories, rumors about the Orion's crew. She had known there had been a lone survivor, but she never expected him to be so young. And yet, as she looked at him, she saw the raw, painful evidence of survival. His eyes were haunted, as if he had seen the very heart of the disaster that had claimed his crew. "Ronan," Serena whispered, taking a cautious step forward. "What happened here? What caused all of this?" Ronan's gaze shifted to the floor, as if the weight of the memory was too much for him. His voice was hoarse when he spoke again. "It was supposed to be a simple mission. We landed on Zrus to explore, but we didn't know what we were walking into. The insects, they were just the beginning. The planet, it does something to you. He paused, choking on the words. "It killed everyone else. I tried to leave. I tried to get to the Orion, but..." Serena's heart sank. She had feared something like this. But hearing it from the sole survivor made the reality all the more horrifying. The planet wasn't just dangerous. It was a death trap. "You're the last one?" Serena asked, her voice soft, but filled with urgency. "How have you survived all this time?" Ronan looked up at her, his face a mix of sadness and resignation. "I don't know. I've been alone for years, floating in space, trying to survive. The Orion's life support kept me alive." Serena stood frozen, her mind racing. She had so many questions, but one thing was clear. Ronan was the key to understanding what had happened on Zrus. And his story, however painful, was the beginning of the answers she had been seeking. Chapter 6. Meeting Ronan. The silence in the Orion's darkened corridor stretched on, suffocating. Serena stood motionless, her gaze fixed on Ronan, who still lingered in the shadows. Despite the dim light flickering above, she could make out the gaunt, haunted look on his face. His uniform, once crisp and new, was now tattered and covered in dust. His eyes were wide and glassy, but filled with something else. Fear, sorrow, and a weight of memories far too heavy for someone his age. Ronan hadn't moved since he spoke. His posture was tense, as if he was prepared to bolt at the slightest threat. Serena wasn't sure what had driven him into hiding, but it was clear that this young man, the sole survivor of the Orion, had been through unimaginable loss. She needed to approach carefully. "Ronan," Serena said softly, her voice calm yet steady. "I'm not here to hurt you. We've come from the Stellaris. We need to understand what happened here. We need your help." Ronan's eyes flickered to her, uncertainty still clouding his expression. He took a step back, his body coiled, ready to flee at any moment. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice rough. "You don't know what it's like. I don't trust anyone anymore." Serena's heart ached at his words, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she stepped forward slowly, trying to show him she wasn't a threat. "I can't imagine what you've been through," she said gently. "But we're here because we have nowhere else to turn. The Stellaris is failing, just like the Orion. We need to know what happened, Ronan. What happened on Zrus? Please, tell me." Ronan hesitated, his eyes flicking to the shadows behind him, as though the answers he held might be better left hidden. But then, with a resigned sigh, he dropped his gaze to the floor and spoke. It wasn't just the insects, he said quietly. His voice shook slightly as he spoke, the weight of the truth clearly still unbearable. That was just the beginning. The planet. It does something to you. The insects, yes, they attacked. But what killed the crew wasn't just the bites. It was the planet itself. Serena's brow furrowed. What do you mean? What did it do? Ronan ran a hand through his hair, his breath catching. It messes with your mind, your body, the atmosphere. It poisons you, slowly. You feel it in your bones. I couldn't see it happening to them. At first, they thought it was just the insects, but after the bites, they started to change. Everyone except me. I don't know why I didn't change. Maybe it was luck. Or maybe something in me made me immune. But I watched them. They lost themselves one by one. Serena was stunned into silence. She had expected a biological explanation, a new strain of toxic insect or a freak accident. But this was something far more terrifying. A planet that could alter the very minds and bodies of its visitors, turning them into something unrecognizable. But your parents, Serena murmured. They stayed behind, didn't they? Ronan's face tightened. He nodded slowly, eyes downcast. Yeah, they made me leave. They told me to get to the Orion. They said I was the only one who had a chance to survive. They knew they were already infected. They sacrificed themselves so I could get away. Serena's heart clenched. The weight of Ronan's loss was unbearable. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the years alone, the guilt of having survived when everyone else had perished. It was a pain she couldn't fully understand, but she could empathize with it. She had lost people too, in her own way. I'm so sorry, Serena said quietly, her voice soft with sympathy. She didn't know what else to say. Words felt hollow in the face of such tragedy. Ronan's eyes flicked to her, and for a brief moment, something changed. The coldness in his expression seemed to thaw, just slightly. He gave a bitter laugh, but it was short and hollow. Everyone says that. I'm sorry, but it doesn't change anything. He looked at her more intently now. I don't know what happened to the Orion. It wasn't just the insects, the planet. It gets inside you. It takes everything. Your mind, your body, your soul. I watched them all die and I couldn't stop it. Serena took a step closer, carefully. I need to know more. If we're going to survive, we need to understand this. What exactly happened to the Orion? What caused the crew to go mad? Ronan hesitated, but finally he spoke again. His voice was hoarse, as though the words were dragging themselves from deep within. I don't know if I'll ever understand it, but the truth is, the Orion wasn't supposed to be here. We weren't supposed to land. Something was off from the beginning, but we were all too eager to explore, too sure of ourselves. And then, once we were on the surface, it was too late. He paused, his eyes flickering with a sense of dread. There's something on Zrus, something more than just the planet. It's controlling everything, and if it doesn't kill you, it changes you. Serena felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a biological disaster. This was something else entirely, a force far more insidious than she had imagined. She took a deep breath. We need to find out what's really going on. The Stellaris is failing too. If we don't get answers, we're all going to end up like the Orion. Ronan looked at her for a long moment before nodding, a glimmer of reluctant trust in his eyes. Then we're in this together. Serena felt a spark of hope, despite the grim circumstances. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time in a long while, She felt like they might actually have a chance. Chapter 7. Uncovering the Conspiracy. The low hum of the Orion's aging systems seemed to vibrate in Serena's chest as she and Ronan moved through the ghost ship. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale air and rusted metal, but now their mission had shifted. No longer was it just about surviving or understanding the Orion's fate. It was about something much darker. As they searched the ship's control room, Serena's gaze fell on a series of scattered data files left behind. Her fingers skimmed over the console, activating the screens. They flickered to life, and the dim glow revealed a set of documents marked with high-level clearance. Ronan hesitated behind her, his expression unreadable. "What's this?" Serena muttered under her breath, quickly scanning the files. Ronan stepped forward, peering over her shoulder. That's not from the crew manifest." Serena's eyes widened. The files weren't related to the Orion's official mission logs. They were classified data, buried deep within the ship's systems. Serena's fingers flew across the console, and within seconds, she accessed a hidden folder labeled Project X. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, reading through the encrypted text. It was a detailed report, describing a covert mission planned by the Stellaris leadership. The planet Zrus wasn't just a nearby, uncharted world. It was a treasure trove of rare, nearly priceless minerals. And the crew of the Stellaris had been sent there, not to explore, but to extract those resources, hidden behind the guise of a scientific mission. Serena's stomach churned as she read further. The files described how the leadership of the Stellaris, in collaboration with an unnamed corporate entity, had planned to divert the ship's course to Zrus. The mission to a distant colony was just a front, a cover to gain access to the planet's mineral wealth. "No," Serena murmured, her hands shaking as the implications hit her. This was no accident. The Stellaris was sent here on purpose. Ronan's face was pale as he absorbed the gravity of her words. "So, it wasn't just the Orion. The Stellaris wasn't supposed to be here either. They knew about the planet, and they knew the risks." Serena glanced at him, a growing sense of dread taking hold of her. "It gets worse. The leadership of the Stellaris had a deal to secure the mineral deposits here. They sent the crew to Zrus without telling anyone about the dangers. They were hoping to extract enough of the minerals to fund their own operation, no matter the cost. But if the Stellaris was supposed to be a scientific mission, why did they hide this from everyone?" Ronan asked, his voice growing quieter, as if the realization of the conspiracy was slowly sinking in. "I don't know," Serena replied, her voice tight. "Maybe because they knew what would happen. Maybe they thought they could handle it, or maybe they didn't care. They were willing to put everyone's lives at risk to profit from the planet's resources." The files outlined how the mission had been designed to keep the crew in the dark, making them believe the trip to Zrus was merely an emergency detour. But the true purpose was much darker, hidden beneath layers of lies, manipulation, and greed. "Why didn't they tell the rest of the crew?" Serena whispered, more to herself than to Ronan. "Why didn't they warn us?" Ronan shifted uneasily. They probably didn't think anyone would make it back. They thought the planet would do the dirty work for them, and the mission would go down as just another failed exploration. They didn't count on survivors. Serena's mind raced as the pieces clicked into place. The Orion, the Stellaris, it wasn't just bad luck that brought them to Zrus. It was a carefully orchestrated plot, one that the higher-ups on the Stellaris had been willing to cover up at any cost. The insects, the strange atmosphere, it was all part of the planet's deadly nature. And now that they knew the truth, it seemed like the leadership of the Stellaris had been willing to risk it all, even if it meant sacrificing the crew to get what they wanted. We need to get this information back to the Stellaris, Serena said, her voice firm. We need to expose the truth before it's too late. Ronan nodded grimly. But if we tell them now, if we show them what we found, the leadership won't let us out of here alive. They've covered up the mission from the beginning. We've got to be careful. Serena stood straighter, the fire in her eyes burning brighter. Then we'll be careful. But we won't let this go. They think they can bury the truth, but we won't let them. She turned to leave the room, a sense of urgency beginning to build. The Stellaris crew had to know the truth. They needed to understand why they had been sent to a Zrus, and how the fate of the Orion had been intertwined with their own. The conspiracy was much bigger than they had imagined. And now, Serena and Ronan had the proof. Chapter 8. Confronting the Leadership. Serena stood before the command deck of the Stellaris, Ronan by her side, his presence still tense but more resolute than before. The tension in the air was palpable. The crew of the Stellaris had been preparing to land on Zrus, but now, after everything they had uncovered, Serena knew they couldn't go through with it. The truth had to come out, and she was the only one who could expose it. Inside the command room, Captain Harrell and his officers waited, their eyes on Serena, as if expecting her to speak. She had no words to waste. "I know what you've done," Serena said, her voice cutting through the silence. "The mission wasn't a detour. The true purpose of our journey was to exploit the mineral deposits on Zrus. You knew about the dangers, and you still chose to risk our lives for resources." The room fell dead silent. Harrell's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to meet Serena's gaze. Ronan stood behind her, his face a mixture of anger and exhaustion. He had already lived through the consequences of this conspiracy once. He wouldn't let it happen again. "You can't hide it anymore," Ronan added, his voice hoarse but firm. "We found the files on the Orion. We know about Project X, about how you diverted this mission for your own gain. Zrus wasn't a detour. It was a destination." Captain Harrell finally spoke, his voice cold and calculated. "You have no proof of that, Ronan. These are serious accusations." Serena felt the heat of the moment build in her chest, her anger rising as she stepped forward. "I don't need proof anymore, Captain. We all saw the Orion, the wreckage, the crew. No one made it out alive, and now you want to lead us to the same fate. Do you really think Zrus is safe for us? You've been hiding the truth from us this whole time. The insects, the atmosphere, the planet itself. None of us will survive down there." The officers shifted uncomfortably, but Harrell's gaze never wavered. "We don't have a choice. Our mission was never to go back home, Serena. You know that. If we don't land on Zrus and secure those minerals, this mission is a failure. You think Earth will forgive us for that?" Serena felt the weight of his words press down on her. The Stellaris wasn't just a ship, it was a symbol of humanity's ambitions. The leadership had made their decision. The mission had to succeed at any cost, but she was no longer sure it was worth it. "Maybe we should turn the ship around," Ronan spoke again, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. "We can use the Orion to get back to Earth. We have the technology to survive. All we need is the drive systems. You don't need to risk us all." The crew was silent, some avoiding the gaze of their officers, others glancing at the captain for direction. Harrell looked more tense now, his grip tightening around the edge of the console. "That's mutiny, Ronan," Harrell said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you know what happens to mutineers." Serena could feel the heat of the moment pressing in on her, a decision hanging in the air. The truth was now undeniable. The Stellaris wasn't just facing a scientific crisis. They were headed straight into the jaws of death. and the leadership would rather sacrifice the crew than admit their mistakes. But could she defy orders? Could she risk everything to save them? "We have to stop this," Serena said, the words coming out harder than she intended. She could feel the weight of her crew's lives pressing down on her. They had to trust her now. "If you insist on landing on Zrus, then you're sentencing us to the same fate as the Orion. We won't survive, and you know it." Captain Harrell was silent, staring at her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. The officers around him shifted uncomfortably, as if they were waiting for him to make a decision. "Serena," Harrell finally spoke, his voice quieter, but filled with cold authority. "This mission has been planned for years. It's bigger than you, bigger than me. We can't just turn back now." Ronan's eyes narrowed. "Then you're sealing our fate, not just yours. We don't have time to debate this. We have one shot to survive. If you won't listen to reason, then we'll take the Orion and go. You can stay and face the consequences of your greed." Serena turned to Ronan, her decision made. There was no going back. She would not allow the crew to be sacrificed. "I'm not asking for permission anymore," Serena said, her voice steady but filled with finality. "I'm taking command of the Stellaris. We're turning around and using the Orion to return to Earth. If you want to stay and face Zrus, that's your choice. But I'm not leading my crew to their deaths." The room was deathly still, the silence hanging heavy as the crew weighed their options. One by one, they began to shift their stance, some stepping forward in support, others hesitating but not challenging her. Captain Harrell's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't move to stop her. "Do what you must, Lieutenant," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But don't think this will be over. This will be your responsibility." Serena's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. They would fight for survival, no matter the cost. Chapter 9. Stopping the plan to land on Zrus. The command deck of the Stellaris was silent, but the tension was thick enough to cut through. Serena stood at the center of the room, facing a divided crew. On one side, the loyalists to Captain Harrell, their expressions tight with unease. On the other, those who had begun to waver, eyes flicking from Serena to Ronan, who was standing beside her. Ronan's gaze was sharp, his voice unwavering as he spoke. The Orion wasn't just destroyed by insects. The planet, it changes you. The atmosphere, the mineral deposits, the wildlife, it gets inside you. It's not just the bites. The Orion crew didn't die by accident. They were taken by the planet itself. If we land, we will suffer the same fate. Serena had never seen Ronan so determined. This was no longer just about survival. It was about truth. He had lived through the nightmare, seen the crew of the Orion succumb to Zrus's insidious grip. And now, he was warning the Stellaris crew, offering them a choice they could not ignore. "You're asking us to turn back." One of the officers spoke up, Lieutenant Hall. He was one of the few who hadn't been swayed by Serena's earlier confrontation. "How do you expect us to trust a boy who's been lost in space for years?" Serena stepped forward, her voice steady, but filled with conviction. Because what Ronan is saying is the truth, and the Orion proves it. We can't risk landing on Zrus. The crew won't survive. "I've seen the records," Ronan continued, his voice harsh with the weight of his memories. "I was there. My parents knew what was happening. They knew we were walking into a trap. They sacrificed themselves so I could escape. You all have a chance to avoid that fate." The room fell into a heavy silence. Serena could see it in their eyes. Doubt, fear, but also a flicker of hope. Some of the crew were starting to believe them, but there was still one obstacle they couldn't bypass: the captain. I'm not going to sit here and watch you destroy us, Serena said, her gaze turning to the back of the room, where Captain Harrell stood. His face was stone cold, but his eyes betrayed a flash of something else. Defiance, perhaps, or a fear he couldn't hide. Captain Harrell stepped forward slowly, his voice low but commanding. What you're asking is treason. You've crossed a line, Serena. You have no idea what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, Serena shot back. I'm trying to save the crew. I'm not going to let you send us all to our deaths. This mission was never about saving humanity. It was about profit. You used us, all of us, as pawns in your scheme. Harrell's jaw tightened. You have no proof of that. We did what was necessary for the success of the mission. No, Serena countered, her voice rising. You did what was necessary for your own success. You put our lives at risk for your own gain. I'm not going to let you take this ship down with you. Ronan stepped forward, standing beside Serena. If you don't listen, you'll end up just like the Orion. No one will make it off Zrus. Not one of us. The crew shifted uncomfortably, some beginning to look at Harrell with suspicion. For the first time, cracks appeared in the captain's control over his command. It was only then that Dr. Marcus, the Stellaris' chief medical officer and Serena's father, stepped forward. His face was pale, his eyes tired, but there was something new in them. Understanding. I've reviewed the data, Dr. Marcus said, his voice firm. What Serena and Ronan are saying makes sense. The Orion was a warning, and I've seen enough to know that landing on Zrus would be catastrophic. He turned to the captain. You've compromised this entire mission, Harrell. This ship, these people, they're not just resources. They're lives, and you've been playing with them for your own benefit. Serena's heart skipped as she watched her father speak out. It was the final push they needed. Dr. Marcus had the respect of the crew, and now that he had taken a stand, others followed. You can't keep hiding this, Captain. Dr. Marcus continued, his voice resolute. You've endangered us all. Harrell's face twisted with fury, but it was too late. The crew had turned. They were no longer afraid of the captain's authority. They were afraid of the truth, and they were no longer willing to follow orders that would lead them to their deaths. This is mutiny. Harrell spat. You'll regret this. Then I'll bear that regret, Serena said, her voice unwavering, but not on the blood of my crew. With Dr. Marcus's support, Serena and Ronan rallied the remaining crew members to take action. The decision was made. They would stop the landing on Zrus no matter the cost. As the captain was escorted off the bridge by security, Serena turned to face the crew. The ship was still theirs. But they had a new mission now, to survive, to return home, and to make sure no one else fell victim to the conspiracy that had brought them to the edge of oblivion. Chapter 10. The Journey to Earth. The silence in the command deck of the Stellaris was almost suffocating. The ship, though massive, felt fragile in that moment. Its systems strained, its crew weary. But there was no other choice. Serena stood at the helm, her fingers hovering over the console as the reality of their situation began to sink in. The Stellaris, once a beacon of hope, was now a damaged vessel, one that would never make it back to Earth on its own. Beside her, Ronan stood quietly, his mind a million miles away. He'd already been through too much, but now his focus was clear. He would help Serena navigate this final journey. Together, they would get everyone home. Okay, Serena said, breaking the silence. Here's the plan. We use the Orion to tow the Stellaris. The Orion is still functional enough for long-distance travel, but we'll need to keep the pressure on the Stellaris' engines at a minimum. The last thing we need is for them to fail. completely. Ronan nodded, his eyes sharp. We can manage that, but we'll have to monitor everything. The Orion wasn't designed for towing. The stress on the systems will be immense. If we push it too far, the Orion might not make it. Then we have to be careful, Serena said, her voice steady. But we don't have the luxury of time. We need to get to Earth. Now. With no time to lose, they moved quickly to the Stellaris' aft docking bay, where the Orion was already waiting, its engines purring softly in the background. The small ship seemed like a lifeline in the dark. It was their only hope of survival. Serena and Ronan worked in tandem, preparing the two ships for the complicated tow. The Orion had the necessary equipment, but the Stellaris was far larger and more fragile. Their first challenge would be attaching the towing cables without causing further damage to either ship. As they worked, Serena's mind raced with doubts. The Stellaris was too far gone. Could the two ships really make it to Earth together? She looked over at Ronan, his face a mix of determination and fatigue. Despite everything, he was focused. He was ready. He'd survived worse. They locked eyes and she could see the trust between them. They were in this together. There was no going back. With everything secured, the moment of truth arrived. Serena signaled to the crew to start the engines. The Stellaris' engines sputtered to life, strained and weak, but they held. Slowly, the two ships began to move, the Orion pulling the much larger Stellaris toward the darkness beyond. It was slow at first, a careful crawl through the vast emptiness of space. But each passing moment made it clearer. This wasn't just a chance for survival. It was a battle against time. "Keep it steady," Ronan called from the communications console, his eyes glued to the monitors as he tracked the stress on the Orion systems. "We can't afford any failures." Serena nodded, her fingers flying over the controls as she monitored the Stellaris' trajectory. They couldn't afford any mistakes. If one of the engines failed, if the tow cable snapped, everything they had worked for would come crashing down. For hours, they drifted forward, the stars streaking by as the ship slowly made their way into deep space. The Orion was strong, but it was aging. Its engines groaned under the pressure, but it held steady. Serena knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They had to make it to Earth soon, or they wouldn't make it at all. This is insane," Lieutenant Barlow said from the engineering station. "We're pushing the Orion past its limits. It could blow out at any minute." "We don't have a choice," Serena replied, her voice unwavering. "If we don't get to Earth, we'll all die out here. We make it, or we don't. But we're not giving up." The crew began to rally, working in unison to keep both ships on course. Dr. Marcus, Serena's father, had been monitoring the Stellaris' life support systems, keeping them functioning as best as he could. The Stellaris' crew was exhausted, but there was a flicker of hope now. The impossible was happening. Together, they were fighting for their lives. Hours turned into days, and the Orion held steady. Serena and Ronan worked tirelessly, monitoring the tow, adjusting course when necessary. They didn't speak much, but the bond between them was unspoken, both driven by the same goal. At last, the stars began to shift. Serena's heart leaped in her chest as the first signs of Earth's orbit appeared. They had done it. They had survived. As the Stellaris entered Earth's atmosphere, the crew let out a collective breath they had been holding for days. They had made it. Despite the conspiracy, despite the dangers, despite everything stacked against them, they had come together. They had survived. Serena stood at the helm of the Stellaris, looking out into the vast expanse of space. Ronan stepped beside her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they could both relax. "We did it," Serena said softly, her voice filled with quiet triumph. Ronan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, we did." And together, they faced the horizon, knowing that, despite the conspiracy and the dangers of the unknown, they had found a way to survive. They had returned home,